Good evening, everybody. Good evening to our audience, but real welcome our co-host this evening. And so without further ado, because time does seem to slide away so rapidly in the midst of these conversations, we've learned that thus far. So without further ado, we know that this is a consultation which is to elevate the Black community's perspectives about how to improve police accountability and scrutiny in London. And we wanted to hear your perspectives on how you think that might be improved as two significant Black leaders on a multiplicity of agendas. But here I want the audience to hear from you, your perspectives. And if you could introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what you do, that'd be most welcome start. So shall we start with Professor?
No, you should start with MP Ribeiro-Addy.
Okay. You're our guest. You're our global guest. So please come down.
So I am Professor Kamara Jones. I'm from the United States, as you can hear in my accent. I am by training a family physician and a PhD epidemiologist, which means public health research. And my work for decades now has been on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of my nation, the United States, and then the world. So I am here in the UK for just 1 year. I came in July of 2022. I'm here as a Leverhulme visiting professor in global health and social medicine at King's College London. My invitation was to elevate the work on anti-racism at King's College in London, in the UK, and beyond. And so I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. This is amazing. So thank you very much.
And so grateful that you found space to be able to be here with us this evening. So thank you for that. And RMP, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
I'm pleased to be speaking alongside Professor Jones this evening. My name is Bell Ribeiro-Addy. I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Streatham. I also sit on the Women and Equalities Select Committee and the Joint Human Rights Select Committee. My constituency is in Lambeth, and Lambeth has the lowest satisfaction across the entire city with its police force. And in my brief time as an MP, I've been a Member of Parliament for 3 years now. I've had to deal with some quite high-profile cases, and in that they've attracted national attention in terms of the police's behaviour. The first one being Sarah Everard, who was a constituent and kidnapped in the constituency and eventually murdered by a police officer, and the shooting of Chris Carber.
Thank you for that. And may I go on to ask you, Bell, about sort of explaining how you as an MP, a Member of Parliament, can influence policing on behalf of your constituents?
Well, firstly, all of the measures that police take are handed down for them, or what they're allowed to do is handed down to them from them by law. And those are the laws that we make in the House of Commons. Significant change starts with changing legislation, changing the policy. So those are the ways in which we can best influence some of the outcomes in terms of some of the actions that the police take. One of the ones that we're looking at the moment, which has caused huge concern, particularly because of the two cases I just mentioned, is that once a police officer is found or involved in an incident, or perhaps under investigation for an incident, they're not automatically suspended. This is something that is permitted under law, and that, quite frankly, is wrong. In any other job, if you were involved in somebody's life ending, or if you were quite frankly accused of a heinous sexual crime, you would immediately be suspended. The police, who are meant to enforce the law, should not be above the law.
That's very insightful and really helpful for this discussion. So during these events, people often suggest changes to improve police accountability, ideas that come from the US. Kamara, can you help us to understand what we could learn from the US to develop changes that improve racial equity for the Black Londoners' racialized experience of policing? What are your thoughts?
So if I can take maybe 3 minutes to frame some things. First of all, we need to, so my work is on naming, measuring, and addressing racism. And we need to be able to name racism as something that really exists. And then we need to be able to look at how it's operating. And then we need to organize and strategize to act. So in that middle question, how is racism operating here? I just want to say a few things. And then I actually brought some slides with me, just like a handful, to talk about how it operates in policing and in wrongful deaths in Black and brown men and women in the US. But when you ask how is racism operating here, what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify some targets for action. You know, you're trying to identify some levers for intervention. And you look at structures, policies, already mentioned by MP Ribeiro-Addy, practices, norms, and values. Now, to the people listening right now, participation in this consultation, I probably just gave you a headache because you're like, what are you talking about? Structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. Gives me a headache sometimes to think about it until I recognize that those things are actually just the elements of decision-making. So structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. Policies are the written how of decision-making, like the laws and maybe more local written policies, the written how of decision-making. And even when we look at those, we need to ask what is not here that if put here could bring more justice. Then practices are just the way we do things. We don't even have to write it down. Just watch, this is how we do it today. Norms are how we've always done things, deeply embedded across time and how we expect you to do things going forward. But those two unwritten how of decision-making are hard to pin down, right? So you might have a policy, but then people doing something a whole other way and expecting different treatment or whatever. And then the values are the why. So the first thing I want to say is that if structures, policies, practices, norms, and values are the who, what, when, where, how, and why of decision-making, the most important intervention that can be made is changing the who. Who is at the decision-making table? Because the who is at the decision-making table affects the what is on the agenda and affects the values, the why certain things happen. So I wanted to just share, this is some work that I had done because often I take this question, how is racism operating here? You know, how is it operating in public health research, whatever. But police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women in the US was an early topic. So let's just go through and think about how do we actually identify the mechanisms? Well, the structures in the US, in many places, there is no civilian review board. I am just familiarizing myself with what's happening now. And I understand that there might be some civilian groups, but separately for MOPAC and for the Met, and there's a lot of stuff in there. But really what we need are effective civilian review boards, first of all, that have power, that are not just advisory. So I would like to learn more from you guys what's happening here, but with teeth, right? And with full access to everything. So that's the who. We need to have community folks policing the police. In terms of policies, in the US, if a police officer does something wrong, they don't even get charged with, you know, manslaughter or murder one or any of that. Just like another person, if they did something wrong, there's a whole grand jury process. I don't know if there's an out like that here in the UK, but that is a policy that prolongs justice and often results in no justice. And also, many states have adopted, many states have adopted a law enforcement bill of rights, which means that a police officer's history of having done wrong in one district doesn't even follow them to the next district, and so on and so forth. I don't know what is protecting police officers here, but you should take a close look at that. In terms of practices here, as well as in the US, over-policing of communities of color, huge, and the stop and frisk and all of that, as well as no-knock warrants, choke holds, carotid holds. We need to address those practices that are allowed to continue. In terms of a norm, like an unwritten how of decision-making that is deeply embedded, we call it in the US the blue code of silence. That is, if a police officer sees another officer doing something wrong, they didn't see anything. There was a case in Chicago, now maybe about 5 years ago, a 16-year-old Black boy was seen apparently maybe trying to break into a car or something. He was walking away, shot 16 times in the back. His name was Laquan McDonald, 16 times in the back by a police officer. That officer's partner is sitting in the police car, didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, see no evil, whatever. So that kind of blue code of silence, actually after the murder of Mr. George Floyd, that is changing, and people are, in some jurisdictions, are being mandated that they must, if they see something wrong, intervene, or else they're liable as well for the wrongdoing. And then also the view of Black men as inherently threatening is a norm, so that a police officer's excuse, oh, I felt afraid of my life, is like, oh yeah, for sure, I got that, right? That is, so we have to address some of the normative stuff there. And then the value, the underlying value that is leading to all these police killings is devaluation and dehumanization of people of color. So if you wanted to have an approach at the value thing, that's another type of approach. So of course, policies are the easiest thing because you can see them, but often I think the most important intervention is who is at the decision-making table and who's not, and it has to do with civilian review boards and the like. So I will stop there.
That is really, really helpful. And just to pause on that, what are your thoughts there, Bell, on what Kamara has just presented in terms of who is at the decision-making table?
Well, part of the problem is there are not a lot of people that look like us that are at the decision-making table, and that makes a massive difference. And no one's saying that it always has to be people of color, but it's clear that those that are making the decisions don't have an inherent understanding of anti-racism. They also may not even accept that there is institutional racism in our different structures. For example, the previous Met Commissioner, not the current one we have, the one just before, she refused to accept that institutional racism was an issue within the police, despite the very, very clear figures about Black people being arrested, more Black people facing more violence from the police. She even went as far to say at one point that we have to understand when MPs who I would say were mostly of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic heritage, were questioning her about this, went as far as to say that you have to understand the reason why we police these communities more is because there is more crime in these communities, and that's absolutely wrong way to go about things. What we know is that crime often is linked to socioeconomics, and that's clearly accepted view right across the world. And the idea that you police a community because there are more Black people in it is inherently wrong. And one of the examples that we have in the UK quite prevalently, and I'm sure this is the same in the US, is the policing of drug use. So there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest there is more drug use in the Black community than there is in the white community, but Black people are more likely to be stopped, searched for this, treated in a certain way, and when they're going to face sentencing, face a much harsher sentence. And there's this idea that there are some types of drugs which are not looked at as much, like cannabis, for example, which can't possibly be the case when we think about a recent case in the UK of Child Q, who was a young girl who was at school, who was strip searched right down to her underwear on the basis that they thought that they smelt cannabis on her. And we know, and it's a well-known thing, that in the city where we have our financial district, if you made that, we know that on many nights of the week there is a lot of hard drug usage going on there, and we know that that particular area is not policed in the same way that somewhere like Lambeth would be.
May I follow up on that?
Yes, please.
So Michelle Alexander in the US wrote a book, The New Jim Crow, which documented everything that you said about the over-policing and then the overcharging, and then, you know, all of that as a way of, in the US, Jim Crow laws were controlling people. And now you have the new Jim Crow. And then once somebody has some kind of conviction, a felony conviction, then many states are not able to ever vote again, not able to get public housing, not able to get benefits and the like. So that over-policing has many impacts, not just the indignity and the assault, really, of stop and frisk and the, you know, strip searching of a young girl, right? But also carry on implications. I just became aware of a book, a report. It's just from 2022, so from last year in the US. I haven't read it yet. So, but I just did a talk for the National Academies for Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine half an hour ago. And they said, do you know that we have released this book, Reducing Racial Inequality in Crime and Justice, Science, Practice, and Policy. And as I skimmed the thing, they were talking about 3 approaches within the police force, within the community, and something else. I haven't read it, but I am going to get the link and put it in the chat.
Yes, please.
We can all look at that, because that's
right.
important.
And yes, Professor Jones, just thinking about those wider implications in the UK, for us, it can go as far as immigration, because if you're more likely to receive a higher sentence for something, it goes over that 12-month mark. And our draconian immigration legislation says that even if you have indefinite leave to remain in the UK, you can be stripped of that status on the basis that you've received a sentence that is that long. And that's a huge worry to some people who are effectively liable for deportation to countries that they either came from when they were very young, or because of our nationality laws, countries that they may not have even been to.
Right.
So let's just hold here a moment and sort of get back to some of the kind of real sharpening the saw on the purpose of this consultation, which is around improving police scrutiny and accountability from a Black perspective. And you have talked quite extensively around some of the manifestations of how anti-Black racism is operating within our context. And I really welcome the idea about a civilian review board at that regional level across London, because I don't think that that actually exists, and how that interacts with a more local, across the different boroughs of London, sort of scrutiny and accountability structures would be really quite useful in terms of powers and teeth that is bidirectionally kind of operating at that strategic level across London, but really working very closely with how these mechanisms can operate across London. I wanted to tune into Kamara around this consultation. We've really heard a lot about being anti-racist and about being around anti-racism. And I would encourage, if you could, also to share the slides that you presented in the chat, if you can do that, or we can email.
I don't know how.
We'll email those around to participants, because I think one of the critical things is that we need to have a much more mature understanding of anti-racism. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the Mayor of London's Office for Policing and Crime, MOPAC, has commissioned this consultation, and they have declared themselves as being anti-racism as a body. So how does an institution like MOPAC or the Met Police address their institutional racism? And what would an anti-racism police service actually look like from your perspective? And I'm leaning into some of the components that you already identified around structures, policies, practices, norms, and values. And I'm wondering if you could assist that kind of thinking for the audience.
So first of all, the leadership of an anti-racism police force would be representative of the communities that were being policed. I mean, that's number one, and not just representative in face, but representative of the voice and the perspectives of that community, because we can find people who look a certain way who would deny that racism exists. In fact, I think racism denial is a huge, I describe it as a huge black hole in this nation's national landscape, my nation's national landscape. And when I say black hole, I mean like black holes in the universe. You know, they're massive and powerful and they suck everything in, right? And they're invisible. You can't even see them. And so, and in the universe, black holes are invisible because even when light or truth comes near, it gets sucked in. So the first thing would be, we would need people who were not in racism denial. I think confronting racism denial is a huge anti-racism need. In fact, to answer the question more fully, I want to say that my definition of racism, since we talk about different things and people say institutional, structural, you know, all this, I want to just give a one-sentence definition of racism, then go back and lift up things.
Yes.
So racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So I said that in one sentence. I'm going to lift up 4 things. The first thing is that racism is a system. It's not an individual character flaw, personal moral failing, psychiatric illness. Yes, it can show up in all of those ways, but in its essence, it's a system of power. A system of doing what? A system of doing 2 things: structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured and value assigned? Based on so-called race, which at least in the US context is so clear that it's the social interpretation of how one looks. You know, and so we can get into how people are trying to, I would say the very important ethnic differences between different groups here. When a police officer looks at somebody, they're not trying to figure out Black Caribbean, Black African, Black other, you know, not when they're looking at, you know, they're not trying to figure out Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, right? They see Asian, they see Black or whatever, and act on that. That is what the race is. And so the sort of race ethnicity stuff, that's a distinction. That races include lots of different race ethnicities, but what race is the social classification of people in a race conscious society on the street. Boom, don't ask how you self-identify. Don't ask, God forbid, where were you born? Where were your parents born? You know, but that. So, and then the last thing to say is the 3 impacts. When people recognize racism exists, they usually say, yeah, it's, when they finally recognize it's unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities, the whole issue of unearned white privilege. And then the 3rd impact, so I wish I had time to just go, but I know that the MP has stuff to say. But the 3rd impact, that racism saps the strength of the whole society, is most often not recognized because the people whose genius is being shot down, right, or incarcerated, people don't even recognize the loss of that genius because they aren't valuing those people. And I think that how racism saps the strength of the whole society needs to be elevated as an important media story, data documentation story in the parliament, story around dining room tables, so that more people feel a sense of urgency to dismantle racism and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. So I'll come back to another part of the answer after the MP has had her.
Your thoughts on this?
Thank you. And I think it's very interesting, Professor Jones, talking about data, because that's one of the major issues that we have at the moment. And just taking you a step back in time, following the murder of Stephen Lawrence, we had a very high profile inquiry called the Macpherson Inquiry. And from that inquiry, it was decided that most of our structures, well, actually all of our structures right across the UK were institutionally racist. On that basis, we had the Race Relations Amendment Act, which is now now inside the current Equalities Act that we have. But from that came a range of structures and practices, things like police monitoring groups in local areas. And, with the current government that we have, a lot of these things have been eroded in terms of funding, in terms of autonomy, in terms of the ability to scrutinize the police. And we've had on top of that a huge influx of very draconian policing legislation, which obviously, as we know, if we already have institutional racist policing, all of these more draconian measures are going to push so much further onto the onto the Black communities in the UK, and it's really important that we do have anti-racist organisations, but we cannot simply declare ourselves to be anti-racist, because to be an anti-racist is not just to, as Professor Jones touched on, not just about your individual behavior or the individuals in the organization. You've got to look towards that system change. You've got to actively be anti-racist. That means taking measures, putting measures forward that combat the racism that exists in society. And if the police are not doing that by actively collecting the data that they have, because they are currently failing on the collection of this data and using that to drive forward systematic change, then they're not being anti-racist at all. It's just reputation management when they talk about we are looking at the issue of racism, or we believe that we are anti-racist, or we are looking towards a force. We want to see action, and a lot of this involves those monitoring groups and all those different bodies that you were talking about, working with them directly, taking the views of the community and pushing forward an agenda which takes us back to a tradition which we're meant to have in the UK, where we are policed by consent. We're not policed by force, but policed by consent. We understand that all of our communities need some form of protection, but we cannot have this protection if the people that are meant to protect some of us seem to oppress some of us, and that's what people see at the moment. So as much as people are having or seeing Black communities, particularly young Black men, as the perpetrators of crime, they're actually more often than not the victims of crime. Yes. And as victims, they definitely feel like they are under policed, whereas as citizens, they are over policed.
Yes, of course, because we want the police as a service, not a force. Right. And so coming back to complete the question, Kamara, did you want to add some additional points?
Yes. And now there's so much, I'm taking notes. When I look down, I'm not texting or anything, and I've got 2 pages of notes already. So I don't know where to start. I just want to say amen to what you said. But therefore, for people, so they're the people who say we're anti-racism, and I say anti-racism, not anti-racist, because if you say anti-racist, people are like, oh, are you talking about me? So right now we're not talking about people. We need to deal with people, but we're talking about a system. But there are 4 key messages when you are, well, let me say this. Anti-racism is a process, exactly what you said. There are 3 steps in the process. You have to name racism because you have to name a problem in order to get started on the solution. But as necessary as it is to name racism, it is necessary, but insufficient. You have to move to action, as you just said. So then the second action in this cascade is to identify how is it operating, not just theoretical, but actually take a look, and then to organize and strategize to act, to intervene on those early targets for action, levers for intervention. But then when you do that one time through, you name, you ask, how's racism operating here? You organize and strategize to act. Are you done? No, sir. No, ma'am. You have to go back. It's sequential. Name, ask how, intervene, organize and intervene. But it's also iterative looping. So then you have to name racism again still, because many people will say, oh, are we still talking about racism? That's so 2020, or, in our country, 1965 or 1865, or, like that. So then you have to name racism again still. Then you ask again, how is racism operating here? Hopefully you have a bigger reach now, more people and more tools, but also people may have come and undone some of the, as you said, there were the policies and all, and it's being undone by the current government, right? So you just have to say, how is racism operating here again? And we always have to anticipate and prepare for the pushback. That's a key tool that we as anti-racism organizers need to have. And then you need to continue organizing and strategizing to act. And then you do it again and again, which makes us recognize that we have to act now, but it's sequential looping, and it may span generations. So we have to bring the young people into the struggle early. We need to reach up to the older people and find out what they knew and what they tried, you know? So it has to be a generational thing, which doesn't mean, oh my God, it's too much. It means we got to start now.
Okay. So we're running short of time now, so we have to be real, apply some brevity to our responses.
Sorry.
As valuable as your comprehensive responses are, and we'll be delighted to go on for a couple of hours, but we cannot. So essentially there you're talking about that process of naming racism, asking how is racism operating here and strategizing accordingly, and that this is a repeated process. And that then leads me to understand that the leadership of an anti-racism organization like MOPAC or the Met Police would be needing to conduct this kind of process in application to its structures, its policies, its practices, and its norms and values. And so that is quite a dynamic and iterative, but very clear and coherent program of action that they could lead on in order to manifest their claim to be an anti-racism organization, police force, or whatever. So that's really helpful and really clear as part of, you know, an evolving recommendation that we could send back as a part of the result of this consultation. Can we move on to considering the health and mental health impacts of policing, of harmful policing? Persistent anti-Black racism has multiple manifestations. For example, targeting Black communities with heightened police surveillance. Other communities don't experience this. The impacts are long-term, including emotional and mental health impacts, particularly experienced by our children and young people, including the adultification, which Bell talked about, often as a result of the way stop and search is conducted by the police, often in an undignified and disrespectful manner. This kind of police practice, namely overuse of force and restraint when dealing with Black bodies, has led to so many deaths. It is a major source of racialized trauma that Black communities in London hold. It is cumulative and shows no signs of diminishing. What are your thoughts as to how this trajectory can be changed, in addition to what you've already articulated? Bell.
Well, I think firstly, again, just going back to what Professor Jones just said, it's about naming it, and a major issue is a lack of acceptance. The data tells us that, the behavior should tell us that, and also it's about believing us when we tell people that as Black people we feel that we are over policed as citizens. Looking at the sheer fact that, you know, treating us in this way is not yielding any specific results other than a lot of mistrust in the police. And I think it's so important to realize why at some points, if you're a young Black man, for example, or even myself, when I touch on my own experience, who is stopped and searched repeatedly, on one particular occasion, you may actually just be so frustrated that you will express it. And your expression of it, because there are these very negative views about Black men. So, for example, you have people believe that Black men are more violent. That is a very well-held view. It's definitely a held view we see amongst many police forces, but in the way in which they were more likely to restrain them. Those types of things play out quite definitely in the way people are treated. And even myself, I work in the House of Commons. I have done for a number of years before I became an MP. But even as an MP, one of 15 Black women out of 650, you do feel imposter syndrome sometimes. And then it's compounded by the fact that you are more likely to be asked for your pass by the police in the building that you've worked in for a number of years than one of your colleagues who you know who became an MP at the same time as you. You've probably only been in the building twice before. And that shows what the issues. And when there have been incidences inside the House of Commons, I think one time somebody spray painted a picture of Margaret Thatcher, and then everybody was searched for a period of time. I keep reiterating that because it can actually have a negative impact, because the police are so entrenched in looking at people who they think are suspicious, they're missing things. If someone's going to send somebody to do something in that building, they're not going to send somebody that looks like me, for the simple fact that they know that the police are more likely to stop them and ask them questions. But with all of that mistrust and the fact that we're more likely to be victims of crime it also can create a huge issue of not feeling safe. Not feeling safe in your own community, not because of other people in the community, but more because, one, if something did happen to you, you're less likely to receive the support that you need because there is less positive policing of Black communities. But not just that, you're more likely to be criminalized for something that essentially you may not have even done just by walking down the street. And that has such a seriously negative impact on you mentally.
Okay, so what we're asking here is how your thoughts about how this trajectory can be changed. Do you want to respond to that, Kamara?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
No, I was very enthralled. Thank you very much, Belle. So I do want to maybe flip it to what we want. So there are 3 principles that I articulate for achieving social equity, health equity. I'm a health person, criminal legal system equity. They are valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need. And if I might, in just 1 minute, say, how do we operationalize those things?
Yes.
Well, valuing all individuals and populations equally. How do I know if the police force is doing that or not? Well, think about how we might value our children or our nieces or nephews. We would protect them, we would invest in them, we would celebrate them, we would ask their opinion, we would involve them in things. We could create right now 50 valuing verbs. So the police department should do that, thinking about their children. And then are they doing that for all individuals and populations equally? The second thing, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices. Well, I think that my observation so far for 8 months in this country is that you guys are just as ahistorical as we are in the United States, acting as if the present were disconnected from the past and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. So the first part is that every person, but certainly every police force or police service should learn the history of policing in the world, policing in this country, policing in their particular jurisdiction. They should learn why it is that they do certain things. And then when they understand that history, then they can recognize historical injustices and then must act to rectify those historical injustices.
Yes.
The third, providing resources according to need, means first establishing a metric of need that we all recognize. So disproportionate stop and frisk, disproportionate detentions, disproportionate, all of those things, disproportionate deaths. So that's where the data part, Belle, that you've been talking about is so essential. So, but then we look at it and we establish a metric of need. And then when there's some resources that come down, we have to have the political spine to maybe say to this community, you're not going to get any of these resources this year or the next year because this other community needs it more. So there's the 2 things. What is the metric of need? And then political spine to distribute resources according to that need. Everybody's going to feel needy because people do not compare themselves to those who have less. They compare themselves to those who have more. And many people might not know what's happening in Lambeth because they would never go there, right? And they say, well, our community needs whatever the resource is more. So there's so many parts to that, but those are 3: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need.
Yeah, you're reinforcing some of the points that were well made by some of our other online co-hosts, David Weaver and Lee Casper in particular, and so yeah, that is really well made. Did you want to add to that, Belle?
Yeah, just thinking specifically about some of the things that I say to our police officers a lot of the time. So in the UK, we experience a lot of response units, and we've seen a lot more because of the rise of social media, where you'll see 6 police officers or such jump out of a car or a van, and they're all there for one young Black boy who couldn't possibly do that much and are spending all of their time on him, when actually there are many other crimes going on where we have a lot of theft, things like that, other crimes which police time could be better spent there, and police come to be. So it's about redistributing those resources, as Professor Jones has said, because and understanding that the level of force that is being applied is not only ethically wrong, it's a complete waste of the police time. Yeah.
Good point. And so that leads us into this other question, and I'm really asking for brevity now, for true. We're dealing with brevity now. right? Because we want to get through the rest of these questions because it's so critical that you give a response, but we also want time for questions and answers. And I've no doubt we're slightly going to go over time because this is a critical discussion. The consultation is about changing how communities hold the police accountable so that police scrutiny and engagement improves the Black experience of the police for all the reasons that you've described and named already. Based on some of the findings from the consultation, people say that a key weakness and threat to things improving is how the police engage with locally led scrutiny structures. And this includes a power imbalance between community leaders and the police, as well as a resistance to change from the police. What do you think can be changed to address this power imbalance so that communities actually have the power to be influential in improving police practice? With brevity. Bell.
Yeah, I'll go with brevity. Well, firstly, the communities actually have to have the power. At the moment, they're being disrespected as part of these structures because it's just something that the police have to tick off and do and go and speak to the community, pat them on the head and say that they listened. If you found that these communities were actually given the power to decide who police their communities and place sanctions on them, all of a sudden, I'm sure you'd see some improvements.
Great idea. Kamara.
So accountability, as you said, and they need to have the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources. So that's what the power would look like.
Nice. So people also say some of the biggest barrier to locally led accountability working is racism and the trauma from the discriminatory nature and impact of policing and the lack of trust that is manifested because of this. How would you address these two barriers for locally led accountability to improve the Black experience of the police?
Can you say it again, or Bell, you answer it, because I had fuzzy. I didn't get a complete idea.
So what gets in the way of locally led accountability working is the racism and trauma from the discriminatory nature and impact of policing. People are unwilling to even be involved, and the lack of trust that is manifested because of this. So how would you address these kind of barriers?
Give them real power. They need to have real power to hire and fire, real power to distribute resources, real power over budget. You know,
that's it. For brevity, just as Professor Jones said, if they don't want to engage because at the moment they don't have the power, if they can see that it's actually being given to them, you'd soon see them want to be involved because they can actually do something. At the moment, they can just talk.
Right.
Very helpful. So MOPAC and the Met Police look for volunteers to engage with locally led police accountability and scrutiny. Some of these are managed by MOPAC and some by the Met Police. Some of the co-hosts have spoken about what it means for these groups to be independent. So, for example, they should be able to independently review police conduct in their local areas. But because they are independent, who is keeping an eye on whether these groups are being effective or striving to include the Black and young people's experience of the police? So in essence, how do we hold those locally led accountability and scrutiny groups to account if they are failing to make an impact on behalf of their community? So say that these are in existence in a way that's supposedly working, how would we hold them to account?
Well, firstly, I think they shouldn't be necessarily volunteers. Because I would say that you put your money, your resources where you have the most value. And these people, if there is a problem, we should be paying to change said problem. And then the community, in order to hold those individuals to account, should be able to decide who it is that holds that position in the most democratic way they can find.
You're reinforcing points that are well made already in this consultation through our cohorts. So I love the sense of agreement and solidarity on this. Kamara, I don't know if you had anything to add, but I think that Bell just hit the nail. So ideas about community involvement in police scrutiny and accountability is at the heart of this consultation. And we've had several great ideas about how to improve that. For example, as you said, resourcing and funding communities and paying the right people to participate in scrutiny activities, the principle of democracy, which is seen as mission critical for an overhaul of that, as is transparency, accountability of those involved in inclusion being paramount. Also, the consideration around developing a race equity framework similar to that which is the patient and carer race equity framework, that which is located within mental health, but has an overlap because there are police powers located in the Mental Health Act in terms of the police role in that. Or co-producing accountability mechanisms so that specific communities design the what, when, where, and how of these mechanisms, as you rightly pointed out, around decision-making in terms of anti-racism.
May I ask a question though, how does that happen? So I am not from here. I don't know, does the Parliament have that? Is it the City of London? Like who now needs to be changed or pressured to make these changes, that we're paying people, that they themselves are accountability as a democratic process? How does that happen? Because we can talk about, but I don't know enough about who holds those strings.
So the recommendations from this consultation that emerge from this consultation will be taken forward to MOPAC. And MOPAC will be looking to take forward the recommendations that we feel are those that are going to improve police accountability and scrutiny. So the ideas that are emerging from this consultation are the ones that hopefully will be brought forward, resourced appropriately, supported appropriately, so that we can have the manifestation of these accountability and scrutiny mechanisms as imagined by our Black communities who were involved in participating in this consultation.
All I have to say is here's hoping.
Yeah, here's hoping, you know, here's hoping. And that's the thing, because actually we've gone through a whole history of having recommendations upon recommendations, and actually the communities are really sick and tired of consultations and recommendations dying a death on the shelf. But we cannot, it's unacceptable to continue to operate in this way. So there is a commitment from MOPAC that they will take forward these recommendations, and it's up to us to make sure that they actually deliver on their commitment. And you can't be saying, as we've already articulated, that you are an anti-racism, committed to anti-racism, and not allow these co-produced recommendations that are emerging from the consultation to actually be supported by yourselves for implementation. That means that you need to stop saying that you are an anti-racism organization, because that commitment can't be evidenced. This would be the evidence of how you are fulfilling that commitment. So yeah, so there are also additional ideas around, and you've also reinforced that point, around timely access to data so that communities can scrutinize police actions, practice, and use of powers. We see that operating at the regional level as well as within the local context, that we need to be more agile around being able to scrutinize that data and access that data, and that data be improved in quality, as Bell has really articulated already. Communities being involved in investigations of police officers, conducting, for example, stop and search. Abolishing stop and search, as has happened in some states in the USA, is another significant idea that's emerged. And in those contexts in the US, crime and disorder rates have decreased. Or communities using tech to give immediate video evidence to a mechanism that investigates the incidents in a timely way. And that these are treated as formal complaints that are attended to with urgency. What are your thoughts on any of those ideas?
Excellent.
Yep, go ahead, Professor Jones.
No, excellent. One word, excellent ideas.
Yeah. No,
fabulous.
They're great. The one concern that I have is, I think Professor Jones touched on this earlier, about whether or not they're held in some sort of law and who they are held by, because it'd be great if they implemented these things, but then what are the sanctions, or what are the issues? Are they breaking the law if they don't have these things? And I think sometimes putting things down formally in that way makes a massive difference, because at the moment, as I touched on earlier, our policing legislation is rolling back, in that it's now going to be easier to stop and search people, when here in London we're saying we want to remove some of that. So, you know, we need to get the policies to line up so that nobody has an excuse to wriggle out of some of the good practice we're trying to put down here.
So there's the policies and the legal kind of like process.
Yes.
And we're talking here from the policies perspective at that regional level in relation to London, and the alignment with the law or is what you're saying is pertinent.
Yeah.
We also know the law is an ongoing and longer term sort of like process that you're there trying to influence in a way that's more constructive and positive in order to help improve the racialized experience of policing. But that's a bit more sort of like long term, and we're dealing with here as a state of urgency. We're dealing with the short, the medium term, and looking at that parallel process of what you and our fellow MPs are doing on that sort of political sort of legal level within Parliament to assist this process. So that would be the kind of thing. It's like we can't wait for the law to sort itself out. We need to do something really urgently now at this London level to attend to these issues, and therefore these ideas, these recommendations that will emerge from this will help to attend to that, and indeed help you will help us to take some of those to help influence what needs to take place within the legislative environment. That's what we would be hoping for, so that we've got a better relationship with what's being developed in terms of legislation that's more responsive and more attuned to the reality of what's happening on the ground, not some fantasy over there that's so persecutory, that's disconnected from the transformations or the reality of the lived experience on the ground. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
May I just say one other thing?
Kamara.
My distillation of the issue here is that people, different camps, will have different explanations of the racialized experience of policing. And some people will say it's racism, it's evidence of racism, and other people will say it's because there's more crime. So that is the nut to crack. So for people to understand that, yes, it is racism, there are 4 key messages: that racism exists, that racism is a system, that racism saps the strengths of the whole society, and that we can act to dismantle racism. But you have to, that first one, that racism exists, that is the hard nut to crack. The Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, that said that racism and structural racism didn't exist, even after they documented differences in health outcomes, differences in policing experiences, differences in education. That is a huge, horrible thing. So there has to be work on getting decision makers to recognize that racism exists, racism is a system, racism saps the strength of the whole society, and we can act. So I would just say, I will volunteer to go to Parliament and do a 1-hour talk for all the MPs that might help a little dent with that.
And I'm sure Bell is going to welcome that opportunity.
I'm more than happy to host you.
Yeah, she leaves at the end of June, so you need to get in there real quick. So actually what we're really dealing with here for true, Kamara, is anti-Black racism. And so what we are wanting to do now is open the floor to the audience for questions, and we've got just a few minutes really, and we're hopeful, Kamara and Bell, that you might give a few minutes more past the hour in order to accommodate the audience. But thank you so much. Thus far, we've managed to get through most of the questions, and I was really sort of not thinking that that would be the case, but that's great. So questions from the audience, Georgia?
Yeah, so we've got the first question here. We've talked a lot about the community and what the community can do to hold the police accountable. But someone asked the question, well, what role can the police play in putting an end to racism? And I guess they're talking about maybe if we can frame it as individual officers, and then talk about the police service as an institution.
Very quickly, there has to be accountability down to the officer. So to the, I don't know if you call it precincts or whatever, but there has to be, we have to look at the data routinely down to the particular jurisdiction and to the officer. And that has to be reviewed, not just internally, but widely reviewed by the community. And if there are problems, then they have to be addressed as problems and removed from the force.
That's right. Bell, you can add to that.
No, I absolutely agree.
That's it. That's absolutely it. And that's your data point, especially equipping those local accountability and scrutiny with that kind of data so that they can make those kind of decisions in relation to that behavior, of course. So Yeah, so that's one thing. I know, Georgie, was there a bit of that question which was around what the role or responsibility that individual officer has for themselves? Is that what you were? I don't know.
Well, so it's just something someone said, you know, what roles can the police play? But we did talk about the police as a system, as an institution. We've talked about the police as individual officers too. So I think it'll be cool to get the thoughts from the speakers, especially since yesterday we spoke with the National Black Police Association, who are officers in their own right trying to make change.
I just have one idea on that, which is there can be no more excusing other people's bad behavior. So that it has to be mandated reporting if you see something bad, differential, out of scope happening, that it needs to be reported, because if you don't report it, then you also could be in trouble. So that needs to be put in place.
So that's a challenge where you talked about the blue code of practice.
The blue code, the blue code of silence.
Blue code of silence. So that blue code of silence needs to be disrupted, and actually you need to be naming when you're seeing your fellow police officer.
It has to be required that you do it, not that you're allowed to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, shall we move on to the next question, Georgie?
Yeah, the next question is about transparency, and someone asked, how is transparency proven to the people? So if this is now a transparent system, if this is a transparent process of scrutiny and accountability, how do you prove it to the people?
Well, I think firstly they'd have to be able to guarantee that they saw everything. And it sounds like a terrible thing to say, but for them to see everything, they would have to see a lot of bad things. And at the moment, I think we're kept out of seeing a lot of bad things. The things that we do see are things that are leaked, things that they can't control getting out. But if it is truly transparent, the truth is we will see a lot of awful things. And whilst they will be bad, it's all important. It's an all important part of transparency and actually getting to a point where things change. Because if we don't know how bad things are, how are we ever going to, get to the root of it?
And I think that that's a really important point. And I think it's about being transparent also about what is working. So some of the comments throughout the consultation is that we can emphasize all of what's not working, but there's some learning to be had from what is working also. So transparency about the terrible things in terms of data, but also about the things that are working as well. So yes, of course. Kamara, what are your thoughts?
Nothing more.
Excellent. Okay. We
One
can
last
have another question.
Yeah, okay. So someone in the audience says that as a young Black man, I've had enough of the negative focus and initiatives. Why can't there be more projects to help us thrive? We are working hard to get into tech space, but the only support, funding, mentorship that we can find are around race and crime. And I think maybe that's a question that came from Kamara when you said valuing everyone, celebrating, encouraging everyone. Yeah.
And we have to view each of us as beautiful, creative, brilliant leaders. We have to have people, especially those people who have power over resources, power to decide, power to act, control of resources, need to be able to see the brilliance and beauty in all of us. And so that might mean changing who's in power.
I think that whole emphasis on thriving is the whole reason, as Black communities, is the whole reason why Black Thrive Global became present. And I think it's a really well-made point. Belle, I wonder if you might add to that, thinking systemically around the different arenas that you're responsible for as an MP and the other areas of public policy to attend to in this.
Yeah, absolutely. It is about resources. And I worry that a lot of people have got to this stage, and I'm sure you would have heard of the defund the police campaign. Obviously, some people mean it in different ways. Some people mean just defund them entirely, and some people mean actually look at how they allocate their resources. So it's important to look at why there is crime in a particular area, and linking it negatively when it comes to Black men only reinforces those stereotypes. I think about a police force, and I don't want to say, I want to say Cumbria, but I get places outside of London wrong all the time. It's really bad. But years ago, they had an increase in crime, and that the force themselves wanted to figure out why it is crime was increasing. And bear in mind, this is amongst a white community again, and they realized that it was because there was an increased use of drugs in the area. So what did? They put more money into rehabilitation, and all of a sudden crime went down. If you want to change something, you change the way the resources are allocated, and that's not even, again, to negatively speak to how at the moment things have been done in terms of Black men, but because that as I said, that reinforces that stereotype that they're doing something wrong. But we know that a lot of the issues that happen in our area are because young people in particular aren't given the opportunities that they deserve. Put your money into that, all of a sudden you'll find less need to pat people down, less need to try and tell people that you think they're likely to be doing X, Y, or Z. I think that's really, really important.
Yes, because we'll be thriving and flourishing. Next question. Thank you so much. Georgie.
Okay. Sorry, the last question then. Okay, so this is a big question to end on, and it's, can racism ever stop? If yes, what can be done to put a stop to it?
I say yes. If I didn't say yes, what am I doing here?
Well,
right.
exactly.
And so, yes, I think we must name it, ask how is it operating here, organize and strategize to act, and do that again and again. We need to recognize the brilliance and all of the loss that racism represents. We need to dismantle the crushing opportunity structures, or lack thereof, that mean that the Black brilliance is instead being incarcerated or sent to a mental institution or whatever. So we have to dismantle those structures. We need to counter the dehumanizing value systems that see Black folks as threats or just bad. No good can come out of them. We have to do those two things. We need to invest in our brilliance, especially in education, and invest in Black communities. So invest in the housing in Black communities. You need to invest in the education, the health, in the really good healthcare. You need to invest in wealth building and businesses and environmental cleanup and all of those kinds of things. You need to, in the US, I would say we need reparations. We need reparations here too for oh my God, Windrush and all of this stuff. We need decarceration in the US, and here probably as well, I don't know. And this massive investment in Black communities, and the massive investment in the end, after you've invested in all of the Black communities and other poor communities, investments around all of our children, because in the end, there's no such thing as your children and my children. All children are our children. We need to recognize that and have massive investments in all of our children and their families. And I am not so much about trying to change the minds of people who already are racism deniers, but I do think that we have to make sure they cannot poison the young ones coming up. So we have to create ways to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of racism denial.
What a wonderful way to end this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have nothing to add.
Well, I completely agree.
I know you weren't going to let me anyway, but I have nothing to add.
No, I'm with you there, Belle. That is the summation of the whole thing. So I want to thank you both so much for your contributions this evening. It's a real wonderful shared learning experience for all of us, I'm sure, who are on this call. My name's Jacqui Dyer. I'm one of the directors from Black Thrive Global, and we really are grateful for the audience being here today also. So Professor Kamara Jones and MP Bell, if you are ready to leave now, you're welcome to do so. And we are really grateful for you taking the time out to be with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Jacqui.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.